Hey everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Course Pro. This is the this is the fall and winter 2022 class, and this is our third office hour. So thanks so much for joining us live, or if you're coming in later and checking out the material, or if you're in another group, or if you're just watching on YouTube. Great to have you watching. There's been a lot of people who've been reaching out saying that they're really enjoying these little Q&As. So yeah, stoked to have that conversation. So we've got a few things to chat about, a few things from last week, and a few announcements. So we'll jump right in. So first and foremost, there's an announcement. The Coppice agroforestry class that I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, it's going to go live this week for pre-launch. So if anybody's interested in Coppice agroforestry, that's cutting wood for a certain diameter and not cutting down the tree, but managing the tree for long-term growth and use. And this was true right up to the advent of coal, really put a nail in the coffin of the pole wood economy, and then oil definitely put the last couple of nails in, because once you have oil, once you have coal, you don't have to wait 2 or 3 years or a year for the wood to get to a certain diameter. Now you can just cut it. So it's a really interesting course, and I'll make sure to put that into the notes this week. So I'll just put that in now, Coppice agroforestry. And then if anybody's interested, there's also a great course coming up called Low Tech Erosion Control. We ran this course last year. It was a stunner of a course. And really it's how do we work with wood and stone to help stop erosion, so that way you don't have a whole landscape unzip. This is a nice advanced technique for those of you that are in erosive environments. And I'll put that into the beginning of this week. Perfect. And with that, I'm going to go over to our questions. One question from last week, Ben, can you share a link to the sample of a large basemap with callouts? Funny enough, Ben, I was looking back at this, and I know Woder just did a really great basemap with callouts, and so he's got a great example. So I've just linked to Woder's example there. Corey, do you have a link for David Polster's work you shared? So I have reached out to Dave's wife and asked for permission to share, and when I hear back, I'll let you know. Michael, I'm having some trouble identifying fire sector other than my obvious accidental fire source coming from neighbors, where on the site I should look for predisposed risk of fire. My region is quite humid during the summer, but there've been fire breakouts recently. Will it be the sunny west facing dry area? So Michael, if we go into his design, we'll see that Michael's actually in Seoul, Korea, and he's right in the urban center. He's like right in the middle, probably like a little suburban area, but generally when we take a look at his base map, it's pretty clear that we're looking at something that's quite urban. So quite tight. You can see his elements around. Michael's actually using the Adobe suite because he has some previous knowledge and was able to jump into it with his base map there. But if we take a look at, here we go. We're definitely quite densely urban. The reason why I said a bit suburban, because we do have a forest behind him. So generally when we're working in the urban environment, our fire zone tends to be 360. So generally we tend to have this 360 fire zone. Now, that doesn't mean that there are areas that will be of higher fire risk, especially if we have different areas either in our property or outside our property that are more flammable or more explosive. So let's say we've got if everyone could just mute yourself, that'd be great. If we've got an industrial area on one side, if we've got a lumber yard on one side, if we have an extremely flammable forest beside us, if we have a grassland beside us, those are all things that while we might have 360 fire, we may come back in as we're taking a look at being conscientious about our fire sector. And let's say this wasn't in Seoul, we might have a thicker line here just to denote that this is a bit of a more fire sector here. And maybe, this house over here is actually fireworks factory or something of that nature. So this would be what I would generally take a look at in the urban area. This is, there's a few things about urban areas that are specific, that are important to know. One of them is when you get to the soil assignment, you'll find that Yes, there is usually a soil map over top of your urban area, but generally you have what's called the urban mosaic, which is basically this fill-like material that's used primarily for building houses. So there's always a little bit of an allowance for things when it comes to the urban environment. So thanks for that question, Mike. I'm just going to check and see if you're actually here. It doesn't look it. Okay, no worries. We'll move on. Woder. Yeah, so Woder, I think I asked you to, or I'll read your question first. For the overview base map, I wasn't sure whether you were asking me to provide a key there. The base map takes up a lot of space on the slide, and the key is very large. That's why I decided to provide the key for callout slide instead. I could provide a key for the overview slide if I change the orientation. Yeah, so I can tell you what I would do because I didn't see that come in. But basically, I would seek to have the legend on both. And I think there's a few things that can help with that. One, as I talked about in my review, we don't need to know that there's grass as far as you've given us. So I think you could pull back areas of your base map to just this outline, this little bit of extension. And you could do that for basically all these areas. With that, you could probably go with a horizontal title bar that ran the length. That gives you a lot of area here and here. And then I would probably work to miniaturize or decrease the size of your legend if you were going to work full-time or in a larger space with the full base map. And you probably will for things like sectors, microclimates, and zones. So that might be useful to have those elements all together. If it were my base map, that's probably what I would do. And then I would just miniaturize it. And the way I would do that is basically you could take, I was going to show you how to do this if you had sent it to me, but I would take, I would copy something like this. I would copy that. I would paste it in the other on the other slide, and then I would delete the extra rows. To delete all the extra rows, and then see if there was some space to reduce the sizing of the font here. Probably remove the bolding because it'll make it easier to read, and then just suck up all of these cells to make them all unified. And there's a way to do that en masse. The other thing I think I said to you, which is really important for everybody, I'm seeing a lot of this is, and I talk about in the tutorials, but sometimes it gets missed. Gutter space is really important when you're presenting work and you're working in maps. A lot of map programs will do it automatically, but because we're using slides, which is freely available and on the web, generally you want to keep gutter space that's in line with what we provided, or you can change it. But basically, we've got gutter space on the top, we've got gutter space on the sides, and generally we're trying to keep a good amount of gutter space. And I think for something like this, I'd probably suck up this column a little bit, and then similarly at the bottom, just make sure that you've left some bare space, so that way all of your work kind of sits inside of that. If it's doable, great. If not, that is what it is. But generally, you'll find that that really helps with readability, and especially if you're ever printing. Printers always need margins to work in because sometimes the printer shifts a little bit, so that could be pretty important. So, Woder, that's what I would do. But again, it's totally up to you. You don't have to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I also mentioned that Laure Dorrs, she has a very similar orientation for her site, but she decided to make north kind of go at a diagonal. So I just wasn't sure if that was something I could also try, because I found it quite tedious having to work with a site that's diagonal and then trying to fit all the different elements into that space.
Yeah, completely. And I would say if that's desirable because it just gives you more space and ease of working, I would say go for it. That's totally fine. I tend to keep my base maps true to north, but it doesn't always happen. It's not always the case. And I completely agree with you. The way that Lauren has done this work is great. She did this all in Google Slides, and it's just very easy, very simple to read. My recommendation to her was simple, akin to yours, was I felt like she could make her title block quite a bit more narrow, and then move her scale and her compass rose into it, and then take up more space. So one of the things, especially when you're working with a site like this, this is about how much size this takes up, but there's no reason why she couldn't increase that size. And that'll just help with the relationship that she has with her site and working with her site. And you'll see that she actually, she did make her legend quite a bit smaller. So with that, that would be very easy to go in here and work with that legend and just cut it up into little chunks. We actually just did this with Jessica out in Hawaii. She reached out and we had a little chat. So you could do that as well. And the one thing that, two things that Lauren's missing here. One, she's missing her scale ratio. And two, she's got an element on her base map that is white. And one of the things we want to do when we're working with base maps, we want to make sure that we've got a color for everything, or as she's done here, she's got some fills, which is really great. The other thing that I recommend that everyone do, and I'm going to zoom in here just so it's really clear to everybody what I'm talking about, is you want your contour lines to move off of your property boundary. So when you've got your contour lines, you really want to be able to take them from inside, and you want to take them, just extend them just a little bit past, just making that conversation, making that awareness that yes, indeed, that element, that contour actually moves up and over the entire site. And then make sure that your labels are directly beside, or right at the end is my preference, kind of like 768, because it's very clear then which is which. And these are 2 foot contours on black, and then the grays are 2 foot as well. So basically it's a foot every contour, but the bolded is 2 foot. What else were we missing on her map? I think we were missing a couple of utilities. I think folks generally are missing their utilities, usually either water or electric, or both, because we've got gas line, generator, well. But if you don't make a note here and say off grid, I'm going to have to ask about it. The other thing she's done that's really impressive is she's given us flow lines right beside those water line flows, which is great because it's very simple and easy to read all of this together. Does that make sense, Woder?
Yeah, that's fine. I guess I'll need to make a decision about whether I want to keep the orientation or now rotate it, because I'll have to rotate all of the elements as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now you may be able to fully select it, group it, then turn it, then ungroup it. That might be a way to do it. I'm not sure, but that's what I would try first, just to see if it's possible.
Cool.
You mentioned that my scale bar needs work. Yeah, I was saying that I'm pretty sure that the ratio is off. I don't think this is 1:5. So if you go through this tutorial in the scale calculator, you'll get a sense of what this is in metric, what we have here in metric, and then just generally, what is this ratio? Because that'll then give you a sense of what that scale is. So if you want to reach out, we could definitely do that at another time. It's involved and it's tedious and it's not very enjoyable to rewatch. And so yeah, if you need some help, let me know and I can go through that with you. We can have a little Zoom call and go through it step by step.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. David's here. David, any sketch software available for Windows? Tried downloading Morpholio Trace since it says for Windows, but seems not to be working on Windows though. Yeah, great question. So in terms of sketching programs, tracing programs, and if you're talking about Windows not on a touch tablet, we have something called Inkscape and GIMP, which both work quite well. The other one that I've been getting into more and more, and I like it because of its price point, is Affinity. So Affinity has 2 products. Both are copycats off of Photoshop and Designer or Illustrator, I don't remember. And generally, if you know how to work in layers and you're relatively familiar with the Adobe suite, it should be a relatively easy way to work. GIMP and Inkscape are free. Affinity goes on sale quite often, and I think the last time it was on sale, I picked it up for like $35 or $40. So if you're looking for something like that, that can work. And then depending on your input device, if you're using just a really simple Wacom tablet with a pen or stylus, you can then have that drawing experience, which I highly recommend. I started doing all this work by pencil and paper, and it's so useful to draw. And so even when I'm doing digital design and say I'm making a base map totally in a digital space, I'll usually print them off and either use transparency paper, or I'll do what's called 4 or 6 ups. And basically what it is you're taking your base map, and you can have it in color or grayscale, and then you're duplicating it either with 4 to a page, 8.5 by 11, or you're doing 6 to a page. And then you're changing the transparency on that image to 30, 40, 50%. You still want to be able to see it, but you want to be able to quickly sketch over it. And this is one of the things that I was taught that was just so useful, is to really think about design in rooms. And once you have things like your sectors, your zones, your microclimates, all of a sudden you get these divided spaces where you're in zone 2, but you're super hot, but not a lot of moisture. And so now you have this number of criteria that kind of give you a room or a shape to work in. And then once you have those little rooms, you can start to draw in great rapidity over top of these little 4 ups or 6 ups. Sometimes we did 8 ups for big sites. And what was great about it is you got a lot of mileage in the pen. You're able to go over it really quickly and sketch out ideas and kind of hum and haw about it. And especially if you have a printer and all of these different elements, it's great. Now, the nice thing is if you're using digital drawing, this is very easy to do. You're just copying, pasting this image either as a quick screen grab, or exporting it and bringing it back in and then resizing it and then putting it beside each other. So it's really easy to do. When I taught this course, it was a multi-month permaculture design course at Seven Rings Permaculture Farm and Academy. We used to do this quite a bit, where all of these students would bring their design sites. We would do digital design and drawn design. They'd bring them in, we'd print them up, and then we would go through drawings, and then we would pass the drawings to each other, and then we would all give feedback. So that can be really useful. But yeah, I would say, if you're looking for purely a cross-platform on Windows, Affinity is probably your best bet if you're looking to spend a couple of dollars. If not, I would say Inkscape or GIMP would be a good idea. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Great. Does anybody have any other questions?
No additional questions. I just was hoping if there is time, I would like to talk about the scale.
Sure. Did you go through the scale tutorial?
So I looked at the videos of you making the scale bar for the base map, and I saw that you took the little scale bar image and you kind of pulled it across the site, or whatever baseline you were using, and then you used I think the measurements of that particular on the site to figure out the scale. So what I did was I used the length or the width of the site to get the baseline, and then I just wanted it to be a sort of round number. So I would say okay, I want it to be 50, and I would divide the length of the site by 50, and that would give me a certain value, and then I would take that value and I would just adjust the length of the scale bar by that factor.
Yep. And the scale bar is great. Well, what we're missing is the scale ratio, or the scale of the whole site. So that scale of the whole site is giving us a sense of, if there's 1 meter on your site, how many times does that have to be multiplied to equal a meter in real life? And that gives us a sense of scale in terms of what's the scale ratio between your site and the real world. And so what we do is we bring in a ruler, And if you're working in metric, you bring in a metric ruler, and then you get a sense of, well, what's the width of this digital paper? And so this digital paper is 11 by 17 in inches, and then you convert that into metric. And then from there, you're basically going to place a centimeter onto your scale. And so if a centimeter goes to 5 meters, or if it's a little bit over, and you need to then place something on top of that to divide your 5 or your 10 more so you've got further increments, then all of a sudden you know exactly what the centimeter to meter is. And then you just put in your information into the scale calculator, which is directly on that slide, and that will give you your scale ratio.
Okay, I think I was just confused. I thought you were talking about the bar.
No, bar is
and
great. Scale bar is great. The scale or the ratio for that area is not 1 to 5 meters, because when I look at it,
Yeah.
one meter there, if you've got 5 of these little pieces, that doesn't equal a meter in real life. So that scale is far too minimal or granular to be accurate. And then when you move to some of your other scales, it's 1 to 1. So that scale or that ratio needs to be taken a look at. And if you just go through that tutorial, it's very step by step to figure out.
Okay. No, understood. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Great. Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, Javan. Can you repeat the software that was recommended earlier?
Yeah, no worries. So free on all platforms, as far as I know, is Inkscape, all one word, Inkscape. The other one is GIMP, GIMP, more of a photo editing software, but I've seen some people use those as designs. The other one, which I didn't mention because you said Sketch, is SketchUp, because I've used it for design. I've had lots of friends use it for design. It pairs really well with an app called Layout. And so basically when you have SketchUp and Layout, now you can produce plans. And if you are specific in the way that you place items into SketchUp, it can also produce what's called a bill of quantities. So let's say you've got 400 trees and you've placed them onto the landscape, and you've labeled them appropriately. When you go to Layout, you can also print out how many trees you need. So it's a nice way of actually keeping track of everything. And I've got a student from last semester, we're talking about potentially making an in-depth SketchUp course for permaculture design. The other one is Affinity Designer, AFF, Affinity Designer and Illustrator or Photoshop. They do a designer and an illustrator, one or the other, and then they do a Photoshop. I'll just pull it up here. I've played around with it a little bit, but haven't really done a deep dive because so much of my work is about making sure that I spend most of my time thinking about my site, and I don't want to spend a lot of my time rendering my site. So I really focus on what is easy and simple. So Affinity Designer, there it is, $55. You could probably find a coupon code that'll drop that down on the internet or through Honey. But the nice thing about this, and this is one of the reasons I keep thinking I need to go back to Affinity, is that it's both iPad and Mac and Windows. So you could hypothetically design on iPad and then you could bring over onto desktop. And obviously there's a Windows as well. And then the other one's called Affinity Photo. So yeah, this must be the designer versus the illustrator. But when I was looking through this, it definitely had a bunch of different illustrator-like qualities. The one thing that it won't do, and you'll have to do manually, is things like scaling and then having an in design ruler that's scaled appropriately, locked, and then you can move it around to make your measurements. And that's one of the nice things about things like Morpholio Trace and Vectorworks. Vectorworks is quite expensive, but is used pretty much the world over. AutoCAD as well is one of those design programs that, very similarly to Google Slides, it will create a very simple image, but you can also scale it. You can make sure, just like in Morpholio Trace, you can just put it directly to scale, and then you can just start designing. The other app, which I don't think is into PC or Windows, is Concepts. And I might be wrong about that. It's been a while since I've looked at the compatibility for that. But Concepts is a really fun app, and it's vector. So the difference between vector and a pixel application is that vector is like drawing wires, and then you can move your lines around as if they're wires. Whereas things like Affinity Designer or other non-vector based applications, they're like pixels and you can erase different layers, but generally you can select them and move them and distort them and all the rest of it, but it's not like they're wires. It's kind of the main difference. The couple others that are more expensive, but some people swear by, one is called Landscape Architect, which a lot of friends and colleagues have used for a long time. And the other one's called Map Info. This was a go-to for Darren Doherty of the Agrarians for years, but ultimately Darren gave it up for Google Earth Pro because he was working with so many clients and he wanted something that clients could use. And this is one of the reasons why I now output in Google Earth Pro for my designs. And generally what I'll do is I'll do smaller layouts for forests or landscapes of different areas and import those images into Google Earth Pro that they can then turn off or on as layers. The reason for this is that Google Earth Pro is very easy to use. It's a folder system, and you can bring in different elements from being on site. So on iOS, you can use an app called GPS Kit. And GPS Kit, if you educate a client or yourself, you can go out and you can take photos and then you can import them into Google Earth Pro, and they will geolocate if you've got geolocation turned on your photos, which is great if you're going back to a site and seeing things over time, if you're seeing changes, or if you're asking a client to observe a site for you or observe water flow. They can take photos for you over the year, and then you can put them into different site visit folders on an application. For Android mobile devices, you'd want to be using something called Gaia, G-A-I-A, GPS. Gaia GPS has similar attributes to GPS Kit. You can take photos, they georeference, you can make notes on it, and then you can import that into Google Earth Pro. Now, your phones are almost always going to be somewhere between 1 meter to 5 meters accurate, which is a pretty big space to be working with. So if you ever want to increase the accuracy of your phones, you can buy a device that you can reduce that accuracy to sub-meter, sometimes sub half meter. This is called a ELF surveyor, a bad ELF surveyor. And it's a small little pocket GPS that Bluetooth links to your phone. And so basically what it's doing is it's collecting information from satellites and then rendering that into your phone. So that way, as you take a photo, or if you're using a GPS application on your phone and you're taking a route or something like that, it will make it more accurate, which, ultimately, if you're doing this full time, it's a good piece of kit to have because it's a very useful thing to reduce that element. One of the things that we've mucked about with and has been successful is that you can also map a site topographically if it's small enough, because you can walk along with this bad ELF and it normally tells you what the error is. So that error is on the X and Y and on the Z. So generally, if it's sub meter, you can walk along and take a bunch of points, and then you can render those points through a third-party GPS application like ArcGIS, which is paid, or QGIS, which is free on both Windows and Mac. And you can render out contours. You can render out what's called a digital elevation model. You can render out water flow, aspect, slope. You can add to that solar radiation, which is a pretty amazing thing because that gives you a sense of where your hotspots are from a purely solar radiation standpoint. That doesn't factor in trees because we haven't given that information into the model. But that can give you quite a bit of information as you go down that route. But those would be the different applications, and they all have their pros and they all have their cons. I think generally anything you can step into that works with your brain and you enjoy is the way to go. I used SketchUp for years, and just generally I hated pulling lines and pushing things out and pushing things in, and wasn't a big fan of it. And yet, when people do it right, and then they can put in their solar aspect, and then they can change things at time of day. You'll find this when we get to the cross section assignment. We do that via cross section, where we take a look at solar angles and we see where does shadow lie, and do we have enough solar real estate to put a tree behind another tree, or a shrub in front of a tree, or behind a tree, depending on where it is. But when you're working in a three-dimensional rendering space like Vectorworks or SketchUp, you can do that on the fly. You basically give it a lat and long coordinate or a UTM coordinate, and then you just set the sun, and you can watch an entire day go across your landscape as you've placed it all in, and you can do what's called a solar assay. And if we're designing for major planting layouts and their production layouts, so these are forests that are going to be for product, or trees that are going to be for product, our first conversation is always, let's respect canopy. But our second is, the number one competitor of corn is corn. The number one competitor of apples is apples. They do compete for the exact same resource. This is one of the reasons why food forestry is such an incredible concept, because if you're working at different heights above ground, you're also working at different heights below ground. And so they are actively utilizing different resources, or you're using up the entire solar spectrum in 3 dimensions. Instead of just having one tree and then one tree, we have all these different layers. But we can do this with cross section. We can put our trees in, we can take our solar angle, we can plot it directly beside our tree at the apex at the top, and we can go, okay, yeah, this gets full summer sun, and at about equinox, we get half sun, and at winter, this tree behind it is completely encapsulated. And if we're in northern hemispheres, or further southern latitudes as well, south of the border, south of the equator, pardon me, then that doesn't make a big issue, because we have winter and generally we defoliate. But if we're in tropical climates, we may want to be thinking about, especially if we're in hot tropics, we may want to be thinking, well, what's going to be that overstory that can actually provide shade? We did this in Cuba. Cuba has a very hot time of year and has a very cool time of year, cooler time of year. And so in the hot time of year, we developed a overstory of moringa oleifera, also called the drumstick tree. And so that would then grow up and create shade for all of its subcanopy. And then during the winter, they would actively, with pruning shears, defoliate the moringa. That would allow light down into the understory for crops. So there's lots of ways to go at this. I think for applications, work with what is easy. One of the things that totally revolutionized me years ago is that I just stopped working to create a professional render, and inform my clients that they could spend a lot of time on a pretty picture, or they could spend time on me thinking about the integration of the design. And this was completely inspired by my colleague and friend Neil Bertrando, who was doing PowerPoint designs, just circles and lines and circles and lines. And the artist in me was offended that he would put that out into the world. But the clients loved it, because he spent the least amount of time rendering the design, and they could read it. They didn't feel like they were not smart enough to understand the design. And I just read this the other day. The point of writing is not to sound smarter than the reader. And it's the same thing for map making. The point of map making is not to make a map so complex. I used to work at construction, and when you get plans, they're complex and they take time to learn how to read and understand line weight and all the rest of it. But in our work, we're really trying to make something as simple as possible, so somebody can look at it, grok it, and go, okay, I got it. I know where this goes and what that is and what this looks like. And generally, when we're creating what's called concept plans, which is what we're doing in this course, concept plans are rough. They're generally the shape, size, generally where water is, generally where trees are. And then we're always ground truthing when we get to layout. When we get to the day where we're actually putting everything in, you get there and you move things around, and you take a look at what's new, and you take a look at what's changed. And so that can be an important piece for everybody to take in, is that when we go to to lay out, when we go to install, we're going to shift things around. There's always going to be new innovation. We'll have been thinking about this for a long time. And then when we finally sit down, it's like, oh, actually, this makes more sense. And so you move things around when you're working in layout. Not the program, but the actual layout, being on site, having a roll taper or a walking measurer, and actually laying things out and then going in and doing it all. So it's important to note that our base map should be as accurate as they can be without making us lose our minds. And then as we get into more specific design, as Wouter and Lauren have done, do your close-ups, and you may need to retrace and redo. And that's part of this work, unless you're working with something like a vector program like Vectorworks or AutoCAD, which you can increase and decrease size without losing resolution. But generally, we want to make that base map and the mapping portion of this as relatively simple in terms of the learning process, because so much of your class should really be focusing on sectors, zones. How am I capturing water? What type of soil is this? And what kind of watering should I be working at? What is my costing for all of this? How do these different elements interact with each other? Does this actually meet the needs of the client? Does this actually work with the climate? It's this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to make sure everything works out. So try not to spend too much time obsessing over rendering if you can. I know it's hard. Any follow-up questions there or thoughts?
I must admit, I found it very tedious to work with slides because I had a lot of things on my base map, and I would have preferred to have a proper layering system, which would have made it a lot easier to just, hide things, and then I could keep on drawing things underneath. Because when you're using slides, you can just say, okay, go to the back, and then you have to bring it up to the, you have to keep on bringing it up the layers to see it. And if you have like over 100 items on the page, it becomes a bit tedious.
Totally. That's the trade-off of free and accessible. There's always going to be one of those three in the contractor's triangle that's going to be problematic. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that slides isn't quality, because for what it can do for us and the product it can produce, it's pretty amazing. Like your base map is a great example. Lauren's is a great example. They look good right off the bat. They look great. And you can get a sense of the site and you can start to move things around. But yeah, that first initial moving things around on something that isn't layer based and isn't vector based is frustrating for sure. But if we were to add in a course on top of this course on rendering, now we would have two courses. At this point, we're not going to do that quite yet. But there's a conversation I'm actually going to have this week with the powers that be at OSU's permaculture department about starting to develop a full rendering and surveying course. So that way, if folks want to go into that level of detail, we can pass on that information. But you have to remember that the PDC is an introduction to permaculture. It is an introductory course and always has been, even if it's pro, if it's specific to the professional. Most of us take 3 to 5 years before we felt comfortable before actually designing a site and understanding it, because this whole idea that the burden of the design is on the designer. And this is what Bill gave us, Bill Mollison, one of the co-founders of permaculture, is we do a lot of crazy things in permaculture that are not necessarily in vogue. Things like reusing water, things like gray water, things like rainwater, especially in the US, there are some places where it's illegal to take rainwater. And a lot of this makes sense in terms of natural law, doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of human-made law, but nature bats last, always has, always will. So a lot of permaculture is saying, well, what can we do that makes good sense, reuses what we have, and just does what we need it to do in the time that we have. And as you play that out into, hey, now we're doing an online course and we're working with people internationally, and we need to have an application that everybody can pick up, everybody can learn. And while there's some tedium to it, it's not impossible. It's just a lot of, is that behind that or not? Do I have to move this over? And that's frustrating. But when you think about it globally and how we're trying to pass this on as quickly as possible to folks, it meets that Venn diagram of all the things we're looking for. If we were to, like, Adobe is out, because of the cost. It's not accessible. Things like Affinity are possible, but not everybody can get it, and not everybody is accessing this course via computers. A lot of them are accessing via mobile. And so we're actively always adapting this course to try and meet as many people's needs as possible, but we're never going to meet everybody. So I completely hear you. I wrote those tutorials. I went through exactly what you went through many times to figure the whole thing out. And yeah, there's some tedium there. But I can say after using, I would say probably 60 to 70% of all the applications I've told you, I actually really like slides because it's relatively easy to get into and it's easy to put together. If we had something that was Vectorworks, open source, and could georeference, that would be the thing we'd use, but I haven't seen it yet. And if anybody finds it, let me know, because I would pitch to OSU that, hey, I'm going to give myself 3 weeks straight of work and I'm going to redo all the tutorials on this brand new program and application, as long as it was supported for life and it wasn't going to become outmoded and we weren't going to lose it. And that's why working with something like Google, you know, the evil that I think monopolies can become, we know it's going to be around. And so those tutorials, at least for the majority, are still true, even though every once in a while they'll change something like master slide to edit theme. And while 99% of the students will be totally fine and get it, they'll go to the exact same place and the exact same slide. There's always 10% that'll go, well, that's different. I don't know how to do this now. They just won't take that step to click where that place was because it doesn't register the same thing. And so it's an imperfect world with an imperfect system, and we're trying to make it as easy as possible. So I agree completely. And there's my big rambling explanation of how we try to go about trying to make something that the majority of people could jump into and doesn't make everybody want to throw their computer out the window.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I like working with slides. It's just a learning from the process that I've kind of, something I've kind of would, I think if I wanted to redo it again, I probably would try to maybe spend some hours outside of the course learning how to do those things with say a vector-based program or whatever, you know.
100%.
But yeah, I completely understand it's outside of the scope.
Yeah, 100%. And then there's things about Google Earth Slides or Google Earth Pro I don't like. You know, the iconography doesn't scale. So if you make, and you've probably seen this, if you make a little marker and you scale out or scale in, that marker stays the exact same size. And so if you're ever trying to take photographs of Google Earth Pro to put into things, it's impossible. So you're always at a zooming level of movement and exploration within that program. So, you know, until you move to the Vectorworks, which I think a license per year is $1,500 or $1,600 or something ridiculous, then great. And if you have 5 clients a month, that makes perfect sense. You know, the cash flow of that makes sense. But until you get to that level, having something geo-referenced, having something that's vector-based, having something that's layered-based is difficult across all platforms, which is why when I found Morpholio Trace, I was so excited because I already had an iPad and I was playing with it and I was working with it. But as David found out, they haven't made it compatible across platforms. And so you can't put it onto Windows, even if they say you can. So yeah, there is currently no perfect solution. And those of us that think we have a perfect solution haven't tried everything yet and have just become married to the programs we use. Daniel Housley of United Designers created an entire program about how to use Adobe for permaculture. And generally the maps look really good. They look a lot like what we produce in slides, but you can have layers and you can move things around. And he has, and the one thing I'll give for Daniel is that he was the co-creator of the Natural Capital Plant Database. And they've created symbols for pretty much all the Natural Capital Plant Database. And if you're working in their canvas size, they scale perfectly. So you can just bring them in and put them in and all the rest of that. That said, it's Adobe. So now you're going to be into a monthly fee, or you're going to be finding an older version, or you're going to be finding a cracked or a pirated version. And that comes with risks and frustrations. All of those comes with risk and frustration. So I think United Designers has probably done the most to unify the design around an application. However, that application comes with a pretty high fee. And for a lot of people, that fee doesn't make sense because they're just learning how to design. So a lot of what we learn in Google Slides is transferable in terms of what are we working with transparencies? How can we work with grayscale so that if we put a layer over top, we can actually see what we're looking at? A lot of folks, I think, missed this in the tutorial. The reason we do grayscale is so that way when we do zones, sectors, microclimates, or if we're just doing overlay for new design, it pops out. We see exactly what it looks like right off the bat. So there's a lot of those things that we'll take as we're getting into the rest of our design career, and they'll be transferable. The one thing I'll finish with is that a lot of colleagues and a lot of instructors in this course have adopted the template and have adopted Google Slides because it's so user-friendly and simple and easy. And for a lot of us, we spend time doing a lot of different things. We'll design, we'll install, we'll teach. We'll be working on our own projects like farming or nurseries. And when we come back to an application, it might have been a month or two. And I know this was the case with a couple of my colleagues in this class. They realized that they just weren't designing enough to warrant keeping all the information about the design application they were using going forward. So they let it go. And when I designed the template, they got really excited because it was simple, easy. Everybody generally knows how to do PowerPoint or Keynote or move shapes around or things like that. So pros and cons. I'm not saying it's the perfect thing in the world. And if you're going to be working in design long-term, doing 4 or 5 clients a month, working with lots of geo-reference material, bringing in things like LiDAR data or other digital elevation models, DEMS, you'll probably want to switch to something else. But for now, it's what we got. So I appreciate that. Thanks very much. Other questions? Or anything that's come up in my rather lengthy ramble about applications?
I just something that come up in my head is I noticed that sometimes there seems to be a inconsistency between what I see in the course materials and what was covered in a previous assignment. So in the design side analysis, there was the macro to micro assessment, and then I see for the lesson two learning materials, there were a bunch of videos on macro to micro. So why was that in lesson 2 and not in lesson 1? That seemed a bit confusing to me.
You mean video tutorials, or do you mean materials that were written on the module work within Canvas, pardon me?
Yes, in Canva, there were learning materials for lesson 2, which spoke about macro to micro.
Oh, okay.
And they look at Portland, Oregon as one example.
Yeah. That's just basically us transitioning to the template completely. So thanks for letting me know. I'll pass that on to Dow and Devin. And we're constantly finding the things that just don't fit anymore as we moved over to the template. I think this is our 5th or 6th class. And every time we find another thing, but it's taken a little bit. So that's the reason. Basically, we recommend that you treat the template as what you need. And if the supplementary materials don't add up, then definitely err towards the template, because we'll eventually have the template be the full requirement. So thanks for letting me know. I'll pass that on to Devin and Dow and the rest of the folks who took care of that.
Yeah, because I mean, I didn't realize until I went to lesson 2 that there was actually video tutorials about that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, yeah, the learning materials.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll make a note right now to send that off to Devin and Dow. Thank you very much. Okay, awesome. Anything else, folks? Okay. Well, it was a pleasure having you all here, and hope you're enjoying the course. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, sure.
We'll see you next time. Bye now.